This conference of the United Nations was conceived by the late Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the leading architects for a world security organization that could put an end to all wars on this earth.
Since 1933, the Democratic Party of the United States had been totally taken over by the Stalinist wing of the Communist Party. And of course you had Bella Moskowitz, who masterminded the entire Roosevelt campaign for the presidency. And then she died suddenly just before Roosevelt was inaugurated.
Hitler has often protested that his plans for conquest do not extend across the Atlantic Ocean, but his submarines and raiders prove otherwise. And so does the entire design of his new world order. For example, I have in my possession a secret map made in Germany by Hitler's government, by the planners of the new world order. It is a map of South America and a part of Central America as Hitler proposes to reorganize it. Today in this area, there are 14 separate countries. But the geographical experts in Berlin have ruthlessly obliterated all existing boundary lines. They have divided South America into 5 vassal states, bringing the whole continent under their domination. And they have also so arranged it that the territory of one of these new puppet states includes the Republic of Panama and our great lifeline, the Panama Canal. That is his plan. It will never go into effect.
December 7th, 1941. The Japanese Navy attacks the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sinking or heavily damaging 18 naval vessels and leaving over 2,000 Americans dead. This is the event that propels America into World War II.
And so Franklin D. Roosevelt swept into the White House, and the first thing he did was to recognize the Stalinist regime in Russia, the Soviet. And this was because his entire personal staff was composed of the Harold Ware cell of communists, which was a fanatical Stalinist group.
Nobody who admires qualities of courage and endurance can fail to be stirred by the full-fledged resistance of the Russian people. The Russians are fighting for their own soil and their own homes. Russia needs all kinds of help, planes and tanks and guns and medical supplies and other aids toward the successful defense against the invaders. From the United States and from Britain, she is getting great quantities of these essential supplies, but the needs of her huge armies will continue, and our help and British help will also continue.
Faced with the new horrors of total war, President Woodrow Wilson tasked 150 of the brightest minds with crafting a path to lasting peace. Known as the Inquiry, this project helps guide his vision for the post-war order.
That our people are wedded and devoted to the idea of international justice.
Members of the Inquiry set sail with President Wilson to work the sidelines of the Versailles Peace Conference. The treaty signed, European powers agree to Wilson's idea of a League of Nations. But in the end, the Senate rejects it. Undeterred, members of the inquiry vowed to continue encouraging American participation in world affairs.
When the Council on Foreign Relations was formed and the decision was made at a dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris in 1919 after the bankers got the word that the Senate had rejected the Versailles Treaty, so we weren't going to become embroiled in the League of Nations. So there was an organization created. It was in Britain, it was the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In America, it was the Council on Foreign Relations, like sister organizations.
In January 1919, 2 months after the armistice, the delegates of the victorious powers arrived in Paris for the peace conference to draw up the terms to be offered to the defeated countries. In all, the representatives of 27 nations attended that conference.
Who did Wilson appoint to head the American delegation to the peace conference? Paul Warburg, who he'd also named vice chairman of the Federal Reserve.
As the Great Depression hits, isolationist sentiment surges, and the country embraces protectionism. But Ham Armstrong and the Council continue to advocate for internationalism. It proves impossible for the country to maintain its neutrality and aloofness.
We are now in this war. We're all in it.
With the United States at war again, and the State Department lacking a policy planning capability, the Council steps into the breach. Over the next 5 years, Council members produced nearly 700 memoranda, a roadmap for a post-war world order underpinned by American-led international organizations.
A great victory has been won.
The business of living goes on in the devastated areas of Hiroshima. In the northeastern section of the city, temporary homes are constructed of whatever materials can be salvaged from the ruins.
I wish you to know that the Soviet Union can be relied upon to protect the peace. Our peaceful nation, the Red Army, and our great Marshal Stalin are inflexibly supporting this great cause.
The League of Nations had effectively collapsed with the war's onset. Its successor was the United Nations, a bolder step toward world government. The UN began with a group of CFR members in the State Department. Working under Secretary of State Cordell Hull, they called themselves the Informal Agenda Group. The group drew up the original plan for the UN, then consulted 3 attorneys, all CFR members, who declared the scheme constitutional. Subsequently, they met with President Roosevelt, who approved the plan and publicly announced it the same day. After that, FDR made establishing the UN his top priority for post-war planning, just as the League of Nations had been to Wilson. At the UN's founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, most of the American delegates, 47, were CFR members.
"1945 lines up with the hidden dynasty of politics and the second seal, the third trumpet and the third vial. And as you can see in the second seal in Revelation chapter 6, another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword." Ultimately, this sword here is symbolic of Satan's deception that will kill most Christians spiritually at 666, but just beforehand, the one world political system will be wounded to death by a sword, meaning most likely because of the influence of Satan through the Kenites and their 4 hidden dynasties, including the hidden dynasty of politics through Edom, which means red. One or more of the countries on one of the 7 continents will declare independence from the one world political system, which will wound the entire system to death. Then when Satan appears as the Antichrist at 666, those rebelling against the one one world system will cease to rebel at that time because they'll think Satan is Jesus' return when he appears in Jerusalem having two horns like a lamb, as you can see in Revelation 13:11, and he'll speak as a dragon because he is the dragon. Revelation 6 verses 3 and 4 line up with Mark 13, beginning with verse 7, where Christ says, "And when ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, be ye not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet." The two world wars being what led to the United Nations in 1945, which is the great horn of the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8. As you can see in the last verse of Isaiah chapter 9, Manasseh Ephraim, and Ephraim Manasseh, and they together shall be against Judah. And so it was in the two world wars, and the notable horn of the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8, not the great horn, but the notable horn, is symbolic of Germany, which is Judah, being used by the Kenites in the world wars to bring about the great horn of the he-goat, which again is the United Nations. The two horns of the ram in Daniel chapter 8 are symbolic of Ephraim and Manasseh, meaning the United Kingdom, including the British Commonwealth and the United States. As Christ says in verse 8 of Mark chapter 13, "For nation shall rise against nation," meaning the Kenite nation rising against itself within the shadow government thereof, which is symbolized by the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 through two warring factions. The unipolarists, who for the most part work through Ammon and Moab, which are symbolic of the left-right paradigm as it's called, which is really Stalinism and Trotskyism, and the multipolarists, who for the most part work through Edom. And after the great horn of the he-goat, which again is the United Nations, gets broken, the so-called New World Order will come into being at the woe of the fifth trumpet, when Satan and his angels get cast to earth, which is when Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh will become the lion of Daniel chapter 7, with Germany most likely having by that point filled in the post-Brexit power vacuum, becoming the leader of Europe geopolitically. So then the United Kingdom, including the British Commonwealth, Germany including Europe, and the United States. The Christian nations, in other words, up until after the deadly wound, which is what kingdom against kingdom means in Mark chapter 13 verse 8, because it's after the one world political system gets wounded to death that Satan appears as the Antichrist at 666. The earthquakes in diverse places in Mark chapter 13 verse 8 being major geopolitical shifts, especially the one that happens when the one world political system becomes a one world religious system, which is when most Christians will be killed spiritually, causing the Christian nations to become non-Christian nations also, which is why you see those three horns plucked up by the roots in Daniel chapter 7 verse 8, and those three ribs in the mouth of the bear in Daniel chapter 7 verse 5. The bear being symbolic of the Ezekiel 38 confederacy headed by Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, meaning most likely Moscow and Tobolsk. So moving on from the second seal to the third trumpet in Revelation chapter 8 verse 10, and the third angel sounded in 1945 when the United Nations came into being, which again is the great horn of the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8, but what follows won't happen until the woe of the fifth trumpet after the great horn of the he-goat gets broken, which is when Satan gets cast to earth and the one world political system emerges, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, meaning Satan when he gets cast to earth at the woe of the fifth trumpet, and his angels will be cast out with him at that time, as you can see in Revelation chapter 12 verse 9. But what follows won't happen until 2.5 months later at the woe of the sixth trumpet, when Satan appears as the Antichrist. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters, meaning most Christians when they're killed spiritually at 666, that same third written of in Revelation chapter 9. To fall upon is a figure of speech that means to kill, so then this star that fell from heaven at the woe of the fifth trumpet, meaning Satan, will at the woe of the sixth trumpet, when all six trumpets of deception are sounding at the same time, kill the third part of men, meaning most Christians spiritually, because that's when they'll begin worshiping Satan instead of Christ. And then as you can see in verse 11 of Revelation chapter 8, and the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died spiritually of the waters because they were made bitter, meaning most Christians, who are the only ones that can die spiritually because the other 2/3 are dead already. The waters here being symbolic of peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues, and as you can see in Revelation chapter 16, beginning with verse 4, and the third angel poured out thou his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters in 1945, but what follows won't happen until 666, and they became blood when most Christians are killed spiritually at 666, when the one world political system becomes a one world religious system. And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And as we know from Matthew 23, verse 35, the Kenites, meaning the sons of Cain, are responsible for all the righteous blood shed upon the earth from the blood of righteous Abel, who was murdered by Cain. And again, Kenites means the sons of Cain under the blood of Zechariah, who the book of Zechariah was written through, where in the first chapter you can read of the four horns, which are symbolic of the four hidden dynasties. It's at the woe of the fifth trumpet that the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 becomes the leopard of Daniel chapter 7, which is symbolic of the Kenites and their four hidden dynasties, including the hidden dynasty of politics, providing the infrastructure of the one world system that will be wounded to death by a sword, and then Satan will appear as the Antichrist at 666, which is when most Christians will become one religiously with the Kenites, becoming partakers of their evil deeds at that time, when they go from being the virgin bride of Christ to the whore of Babylon. And I heard another out of the altar say, Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments.